The iron gate of the territorial prison in Yuma, Arizona, swung open with a metallic groan that echoed across the desert morning, and Jackson Xavier stepped into freedom for the first time in 7 years. The sun hit his eyes with blinding force, and he raised a weathered hand to shield them, squinting at the dusty road that stretched toward the horizon where mountains rose like ancient sentinels. His boots, prison-issued and worn thin, touched the packed earth outside the walls, and he drew in a breath of air that tasted like mesquite and possibility. The guard who'd walked him to the gate said nothing, just turned and disappeared back into the shadows of that hellhole Jackson had called home since he was 22 years old. Now 29, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before and a scar on his jaw from a fight he'd rather forget. He carried only a small canvas bag with his few possessions, and the memory of a promise made under a cottonwood tree in St. George, Utah. It took him 3 days of walking, hitching rides on freight wagons, and finally trading the last of his prison wages for a seat on a stagecoach to make it back to Utah territory. The landscape changed from the brutal heat of Arizona's desert to the red rock canyons and sage-covered hills of southern Utah, and with each mile, his heart beat faster. 7 years ago, he'd been arrested for a crime he didn't commit, accused of stealing cattle from a rancher who'd had it in for him since Jackson had started courting Clara Hayes. The rancher's son had done the stealing, but money and influence had painted Jackson as the guilty party, and the judge had given him 7 years without blinking. The last thing he'd seen before they hauled him away in chains was Clara's face, pale and tear-streaked, as she stood in the dusty street outside the courthouse in St. George. "I'll wait," she'd said, her voice breaking. "Right here. I'll wait for you, Jackson." He'd shaken his head, tried to tell her to move on to find someone else to live her life, but she just gripped the iron bars of the wagon and repeated those words like a prayer. "I'll wait right here." The stagecoach rolled into St. George on a Wednesday afternoon in late September of 1883, and Jackson's hands were shaking as he stepped down onto the wooden platform. The town hadn't changed much. The same white courthouse sat at the center of town, its red sandstone foundation glowing in the afternoon light. The same mercantile, the same saloon with its painted sign, the same hotel where traveling salesmen stayed. But Jackson wasn't looking at any of that. His eyes went straight to the cottonwood tree that stood at the corner of Main Street and Tabernacle, its leaves golden in the autumn sun. And there she was. Clara Hayes stood beneath that tree, exactly where she'd stood 7 years ago, wearing a simple blue calico dress that the wind pressed against her frame. Her hair, dark as midnight, was pulled back in a braid that hung over one shoulder, and her hands clutched a small basket. She wasn't looking at the stagecoach, wasn't looking at anything in particular, just standing there as if she'd been standing there every day for 7 years, waiting. Jackson's feet moved before his mind could catch up. He dropped his bag right there on the platform and walked toward her, his long strides eating up the distance between them. People on the street stopped and stared, recognizing him perhaps, or maybe just sensing the moment unfolding before them. Clara must have heard his footsteps because she turned, and when her eyes met his, the world stopped turning. "Jackson," she breathed, and the basket fell from her hands, apples rolling across the packed dirt. He reached her in 3 more strides and caught her as she stumbled forward, pulling her into his arms with a force that lifted her feet off the ground. She was crying, her face buried in his shoulder, her hands clutching at his back as if she couldn't believe he was real. He held her so tight he was afraid he might break her, but he couldn't let go, couldn't loosen his grip even a fraction. "You waited," he said against her hair, his voice rough with emotion he'd kept locked away for 7 years. Clara, you actually waited. I told you I would, she said, pulling back just enough to look at his face. Her hands came up to cup his jaw, her thumbs tracing the scar there, the new lines, the evidence of time lost. I told you, Jackson, I meant it. 7 years, he said, shaking his head in wonder. You should have moved on, you should have found someone else. You were only 19. I'm 26 now, she said with a small smile that made his heart ache, and there was never anyone else. There could never be anyone else. He kissed her then, right there in the middle of Main Street with half the town watching, and it was like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. Her lips were soft and warm, tasting of tears and hope, and when she kissed him back with equal fervor, he felt something inside him that had been frozen for 7 years finally begin to thaw. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jackson became aware of the audience they'd gathered. The town's minister stood outside the church with his mouth hanging open. Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile had her hand over her heart. Even old Tom Riley, who ran the saloon and never showed emotion about anything, was grinning like a fool. I need to explain, Clara said quickly, her cheeks flushed. I need to tell you what happened, why I'm still here, what I've been doing. I don't care, Jackson said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. You're here. That's all that matters. No, you need to know. She bent to gather the fallen apples, and Jackson helped her, their hands brushing with each piece of fruit retrieved. When the basket was full again, she took his hand and led him away from the main street, down a side path that wound between buildings toward the edge of town. They walked in silence, Jackson still trying to process the reality of her beside him, the feel of her hand in his, the fact that she'd actually kept her promise. She led him to a small house on the outskirts of town, a neat little place with a garden out front and chickens pecking in a yard enclosed by a white picket fence. Jackson stared at it in confusion. This is mine, Clara said, pushing open the gate. I bought it 3 years ago. Come inside. The interior was simple but comfortable, with handmade curtains on the windows and a braided rug on the wooden floor. A small kitchen area occupied one corner, and through an open door, Jackson could see a bedroom with a quilt-covered bed. Clara set the basket on the table and turned to face him, wringing her hands nervously. After you were taken away, my father disowned me, she said in a rush. He told me I was a fool for believing in you, for wanting to wait. He said you were guilty, that I was bringing shame on the family. My mother tried to defend me, but he wouldn't hear it, so I left. I was 19 years old, and I left my family home with nothing but the clothes on my back and the money I'd saved from selling eggs. Jackson's jaw tightened. Clara, I'm so sorry. Don't be, she said firmly. It was my choice. I got work at the hotel, cleaning rooms and helping in the kitchen. Mrs. Henderson at the Mercantile gave me extra work sometimes too. I saved every penny I could. I lived in a tiny room above the saloon for 3 years, and then I had enough to buy this place. It's small, but it's mine. It's ours if you want it. If I want it, Jackson repeated, moving toward her. Clara, I've dreamed of nothing but having a life with you for 7 years, but I can't let you sacrifice everything for me. Your family, your reputation, my family chose their pride over me, Clara interrupted. My reputation doesn't matter when I know the truth. You're innocent, Jackson. I've always known that, and while you were gone, I proved it. Jackson froze. What do you mean? Clara's eyes flashed with something fierce and triumphant. Thomas Garrett, the rancher's son who framed you, he couldn't keep his mouth shut when he was drunk. About 2 years ago, he was in the saloon bragging about how he'd gotten away with stealing those cattle and pinning it on you. I was there, bringing up fresh linens, and I heard him. I got Tom Riley to testify to what he'd heard too. We went to the sheriff, but he said without more proof, there was nothing he could do. So I wrote to the territorial governor. I wrote to the prison warden. I wrote to every judge and lawyer I could find. I've spent the last 2 years fighting to get your conviction overturned." Jackson sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, overwhelmed. "Clara, that must have cost you everything you saved." "It did," she admitted. "Every penny I had beyond what I needed to keep this house went to lawyers and appeals. But I got a letter 3 months ago. Your conviction was overturned. You were supposed to be released and given compensation for wrongful imprisonment." "Didn't they tell you?" "No," Jackson said slowly. "The warden just said I'd served my time and I was free to go. He didn't say anything about compensation or overturned convictions." Clara's face darkened. "That's because he probably kept the compensation money for himself. The letter said you were owed $500 for wrongful imprisonment. We need to report this." $500 was more money than Jackson had ever seen in his life. It was enough to start over, to buy land, to build a real future. And Clara had fought for it, fought for him when he'd had no one else. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why would you do all this for me? 7 years is a long time, Clara. You could have had a dozen marriage proposals. You could have had a family by now." She knelt before him, taking both his hands in hers. "I did have proposals," she said softly. 6 of them, to be exact, but I didn't want any of those men. I wanted you, Jackson Xavier. I've wanted you since I was 16 years old and you helped me when my horse threw me on the road outside town. Do you remember that?" "I remember," Jackson said, closing his eyes at the memory. "You had dirt all over your dress and you were trying not to cry even though I could tell you were hurt. You were so gentle with me," Clara continued. "You checked to make sure I wasn't seriously injured, and then you caught my horse and rode back into town with me to make sure I got home safe. My father yelled at you for touching me, accused you of improper behavior, but you just tipped your hat and rode away. I knew then that you were a good man. The best man I'd ever meet. And when you started courting me 2 years later, when you asked my father's permission, and he said yes only because you'd started working for the Garrett Ranch and were making decent money, I was the happiest girl in the world." "Then the Garretts destroyed everything," Jackson said bitterly. "No," Clara said firmly. "They tried to, but they didn't succeed. You're here now, you're free, and we're going to get that compensation money and build the life we should have had 7 years ago." Jackson pulled her up and into his lap, wrapping his arms around her and burying his face in her hair. She held him just as tightly, and they stayed like that for a long time, just breathing together, feeling the reality of reunion sink in. "I love you," Jackson said finally. "I never stopped loving you, not for one single day." "I love you too," Clara whispered, "and I never will stop." They spent the rest of that day and evening talking, 7 years of separation compressed into hours of conversation. Clara told him about the town's changes, about who had married whom, who had died, who had moved away. She told him about her work, about the satisfaction of owning her own home, about the loneliness of waiting. Jackson told her about prison, though he kept the worst parts to himself. He told her about the men he'd met, some good and some evil. He told her about learning to read better in the prison library, about the books that had kept him sane, about the hope that had kept him alive. When darkness fell, Clara lit the oil lamps and made them dinner, simple but good, and Jackson marveled at the domesticity of it all. This woman had waited for him, fought for him, built a life that could include him. The weight of that devotion was almost too much to bear. "Where will you sleep tonight?" Clara asked as they finished eating, a blush creeping up her cheeks. "I mean, we're not married yet, and I know people will talk if I'll sleep in the barn," Jackson said, though the thought of being separated from her even by that short distance was painful. "I won't compromise your reputation, Clara. We'll do this right." Relief and disappointment warred in her expression, but she nodded. "Tomorrow, we'll go to the sheriff about the compensation money, and then, if you're willing, we'll talk to the minister about a wedding." "If I'm willing." Jackson laughed, the sound feeling foreign after so many years. "Clara, I'd marry you tomorrow if you'd have me." "Then that's what we'll do," she said, her smile radiant. "We've waited long enough." Jackson slept in Clara's barn that night, on a pile of clean hay with a horse blanket for warmth. And despite the simplicity of it, he slept better than he had in 7 years. The knowledge that Clara was just yards away, that she'd waited and fought for him, that tomorrow they would begin the process of building their life together, filled him with a peace he'd thought he'd never feel again. Morning came with rooster calls and golden light streaming through the barn's gaps. Jackson washed at the pump in the yard, using the sliver of soap Clara had left for him, and changed into the clean clothes she'd somehow known to have ready. They were simple, just a work shirt and trousers, but they fit well enough, and they didn't smell like prison. Clara emerged from the house in a green dress that brought out the color of her eyes, her hair pinned up in a way that made her look older, more mature than the girl he'd left behind. She'd made breakfast, eggs from her chickens and bread she'd baked the day before, and they ate together at her small table, their knees touching beneath it. "Ready?" she asked when they'd finished. "Ready," Jackson confirmed. The sheriff's office was in the same building it had always been, attached to the small jail that mostly housed drunks sleeping off their excesses. Sheriff Morrison was new since Jackson had been sent away, a middle-aged man with gray in his mustache and a star on his chest that looked like it had seen better days. He looked up when Jackson and Clara entered, and his eyes widened slightly. "Jackson Xavier," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Heard you were back in town." "Sheriff," Jackson said with a nod, "we need to talk to you about some missing compensation money." Morrison's expression became guarded. "What compensation money?" Clara stepped forward, pulling a folded letter from her pocket. "This letter from the territorial governor's office states that Jackson's conviction was overturned and that he was to receive $500 in compensation for wrongful imprisonment. The warden at Yuma should have released that money to him when he was freed. He didn't." The sheriff took the letter and read it carefully, his frown deepening. "This is official," he said finally. "If the warden kept this money, that's theft from the territorial government. I'll need to send a telegraph to Yuma and to the governor's office. It might take some time to sort out." "How long?" Jackson asked. "Could be weeks, could be months," Morrison said honestly. "Government doesn't move fast, but I'll make sure you get what's owed to you. I've heard about your case, Xavier. What happened to you wasn't right." "No, it wasn't," Clara said sharply. "And Thomas Garrett should be arrested for what he did." Morrison sighed. "I know what Garrett did. Whole town knows by now. But getting a conviction is another matter. He's lawyered up and his father's still got influence. I've got it on my list, but these things take time." Jackson put a hand on Clara's arm, feeling her tension. "We appreciate anything you can do, Sheriff." They left the office with the matter in Morrison's hands, and Clara was visibly frustrated. "It's not fair," she said as they walked. 7 years of your life stolen, and they can't even give you the compensation you're owed right away." "We'll get it eventually," Jackson said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "And in the meantime, I need to find work. I can't just live off your charity, Clara." "It's not charity," she protested. "What's mine is yours." "Not until we're married," Jackson said, "and even then I need to contribute, I need to provide." Clara studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, the Thompson Ranch is always looking for good hands. And you were one of the best riders in the territory before. Well, before everything." The Thompson Ranch was north of town, a sprawling operation that ran cattle and horses across thousands of acres of Utah territory. Jackson and Clara rode out together on a borrowed horse, Clara sitting side saddle behind him with her arms around his waist, and Jackson tried not to think about how right it felt to have her there. Robert Thompson was a fair man in his 50s who remembered Jackson from before his imprisonment. He listened to Jackson's story, glanced at Clara with respect in his eyes, and then offered Jackson a job without hesitation. "I need good men," Thompson said, "and I always thought you got a raw deal. Pays $30 a month plus room and board, but I understand you'll want to stay in town with Miss Hayes. I can do 35 without the boarding if you're willing to make the ride each day." $35 a month was generous, more than Jackson had expected. "I'll take it, sir." "Thank you. Start Monday," Thompson said. "That gives you a few days to settle in." As they rode back to town, Clara was quiet and Jackson could feel the tension in her posture. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Monday is 4 days away," she said. "That's 4 more days of you sleeping in my barn, of people gossiping about us, of waiting when we've already waited 7 years. Jackson, let's not wait anymore. Let's get married now." "Now?" Jackson twisted to look at her. "Clara, don't you want a proper wedding? A dress, guests, all of that?" "I want you," she said simply. "I want to be your wife. I want to wake up next to you without worrying about propriety or what people will say. We can have a small ceremony, just us and the minister and a couple of witnesses. Please, Jackson." How could he say no to that? How could he deny her anything when she'd given up everything for him? "All right," he said, his heart swelling. "Let's go talk to the minister." Reverend Michaels was surprised to see them, but not entirely shocked. The whole town had seen their reunion the day before, and news traveled fast in a place like St. George. When they explained what they wanted, he smiled gently. "I think you two have earned the right to stop waiting," he said. "Can you be here tomorrow afternoon?" "I'll need to file the proper paperwork, but that should be enough time." "Tomorrow," Clara breathed, her eyes shining. "We can wait 1 more day." They spent that afternoon preparing. Clara went to the mercantile and bought fabric for a new dress, something simple but pretty that she could make in an evening. Jackson went to the barber and got his hair cut, and his beard trimmed properly for the first time in years, and he bought a new shirt and a string tie with the last of his prison wages. They had dinner together again that night, but this time the air between them was charged with anticipation and something deeper, a knowing that everything was about to change. "I'm nervous," Clara admitted as they sat on her small porch, watching the stars come out. "Isn't that silly? I've been waiting for this for 7 years, and now I'm nervous." "I'm nervous too," Jackson confessed. He took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I want to be a good husband to you, Clara. I want to give you everything you deserve, but I'm starting with nothing. Less than nothing, really. I'm an ex-convict with no money and a job that pays barely enough to live on." "You're starting with me," Clara said, turning to face him. "And I'm starting with you. That's more than most people have. We'll build the rest together." Jackson kissed her then, slow and sweet, and felt her melt against him. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing unsteadily, he knew he needed to leave before his resolve crumbled. "I should go," he said roughly. "1 more night in the barn." "1 more night," Clara agreed, her voice equally unsteady. "And then never again." Jackson didn't sleep much that night. He lay in the hay, staring at the barn roof, thinking about the next day and all the days that would follow. He thought about the life they would build together, about children maybe, about growing old with Clara by his side. He thought about how close he'd come to losing all of this, and how miraculous it was that she'd waited. Morning came too slowly and too fast all at once. Jackson washed and dressed carefully, his hands shaking slightly as he tied his new string tie. When he walked to the house, Clara was already up, wearing the dress she'd made. It was the color of cream with tiny blue flowers embroidered at the collar and cuffs, and she looked so beautiful it made his chest ache. "You look perfect," he said. "So do you," she replied, her smile tremulous. "Are you ready?" "More ready than I've ever been for anything." They walked to the church together, hand in hand, and found Reverend Michaels waiting with two witnesses, Mrs. Henderson from the mercantile and Tom Riley from the saloon, unlikely friends who'd both apparently been keeping Clara's secrets for years. The church was empty except for them, sunlight streaming through the windows and illuminating the simple wooden pews. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. Jackson's voice was steady as he repeated the vows, promising to love and cherish Clara for as long as they both lived. Clara's voice wavered with emotion but never faltered. Her eyes locked on his as she made the same promises. When Reverend Michaels pronounced them husband and wife and told Jackson he could kiss his bride, the kiss was tender and full of promise, a seal on 7 years of waiting and the beginning of the rest of their lives. They signed the marriage certificate with Mrs. Henderson and Tom Riley as witnesses, and then they were walking back out into the afternoon sunshine as husband and wife. Clara was laughing, giddy with joy, and Jackson felt lighter than he had in years, as if some enormous weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Mrs. Xavier," he said, trying out the name. "I like the sound of that," Clara said, beaming up at him. "Take me home, husband." They went back to Clara's house, their house now, and closed the door on the world. Jackson had imagined this moment countless times during his imprisonment, but the reality was sweeter than any fantasy. Clara was nervous and eager all at once, and Jackson was determined to be gentle, to make this good for her, to show her with actions what words couldn't express. "I love you," he whispered against her skin as the afternoon light faded to evening. "I love you so much." "Show me," Clara whispered back, and he did. Later, as they lay tangled together in the bed, Clara's head on his chest and his arms around her, Jackson felt something he'd thought he'd never feel again. Peace. Complete and total peace. Clara traced lazy patterns on his chest, and he ran his fingers through her loose hair, marveling that this was real, that she was his wife, that they had the rest of their lives ahead of them. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked softly. "How lucky I am," Jackson said. "How I don't deserve you, but I'm going to spend every day trying to." "You deserve everything good in this world," Clara said fiercely, propping herself up to look at him. "Don't ever think otherwise. What happened to you was wrong, but we're going to make something right out of it. We're going to build a good life, Jackson. I know we are." "I believe you," he said, and he meant it. The weekend passed in a haze of happiness, getting used to being married, to sharing space and meals and a bed. On Monday morning, Jackson woke before dawn to start his first day at the Thompson Ranch. Clara woke with him and made him breakfast, packing him a lunch in a tin pail like she'd done it 100 times before. "Be safe," she said, kissing him at the door. "Always," he promised. The work at the Thompson Ranch was hard but honest. Jackson spent his days riding fence lines, moving cattle, breaking horses, all the things he'd done before his imprisonment. His body remembered the work even if his muscles protested at first, and Robert Thompson was pleased with his efforts. The other ranch hands were wary of him initially, knowing his history, but Jackson kept his head down and his work ethic high, and gradually they warmed to him. Weeks passed, then months. Jackson and Clara fell into a comfortable routine. He worked the ranch 6 days a week, and on Sundays they went to church together and spent the day at home, working in the garden or making small improvements to the house. Clara continued her work at the hotel a few days a week, saving money for their future, though Jackson insisted she didn't need to. "I like working," she told him. "I like feeling useful and having my own income. Don't try to stop me." He didn't. He was learning that Clara was more independent than the girl he'd courted 7 years ago, and he loved her all the more for it. Winter came to southern Utah, cold but not unbearable, and Christmas found them cozy in their little house with a small tree Clara had decorated with strings of popcorn and paper ornaments. Jackson's present to her was a new winter coat he'd saved up for, warm and practical. Her present to him was a pair of leather gloves she'd made herself and a book of poetry. "I remember you liked reading in prison," she said shyly. "I thought you might like having something beautiful to read now that you're free." He did like it. They read together by the fire on cold evenings, Clara curled against his side, and Jackson felt his soul healing bit by bit. It was in February when Sheriff Morrison finally came to see them with news about the compensation money. Jackson was at the ranch, but Clara was home, and Morrison found her hanging laundry despite the chill. "Mrs. Xavier," he said, tipping his hat. "Is your husband home?" "He's at work," Clara said, her stomach tightening with worry. "Is something wrong?" "No, actually, it's good news." The territorial government finally processed the appeal about the compensation money. The warden at Yuma has been fired for embezzlement. Turns out he was keeping money from multiple releases. Jackson's $500 is waiting for him at the bank in town. "I deposited it in an account in his name this morning." Clara's hands flew to her mouth. $500. "It's really there," Morrison confirmed. "And there's more. The Garrett family has agreed to pay restitution for the wrongful accusation. Thomas Garrett won't be going to jail, his father made sure of that, but they're paying $10,000 to be split among the people they've wronged. Jackson's share is $2,000. Clara sat down hard on the porch step, her legs suddenly weak. $2,000. $2,500 total, with the $500 from the government, Morrison said. "That's enough to buy land, build a real house, start a business. Jackson's been cleared of all charges, and he's got the means to make a fresh start. Thought you'd want to know right away." After Morrison left, Clara finished the laundry in a daze. $2,500 was a fortune, more money than she'd ever imagined having. It was a future, a real future, not just scraping by but actually building something lasting. When Jackson came home that evening, tired and dusty from a long day, Clara met him at the door, practically vibrating with excitement. She told him everything and watched his face go through a dozen emotions. Disbelief, anger at how long it had taken, relief, and finally joy. $2,500, he repeated, sinking into a chair. "That's enough to buy our own land, to build a real house, to start a ranch of our own maybe." "Is that what you want?" Clara asked, kneeling beside him. "Your own ranch?" "I want whatever will make you happy," Jackson said, cupping her face. "What do you want, Clara?" She thought about it seriously. "I want land," she said finally. "I want a bigger house where we can raise children. I want chickens and a garden and maybe some cattle. I want to build something that's ours, something no one can take away from us." "Then that's what we'll do," Jackson said, and kissed her. They spent the next few weeks looking at available land around St. George. There were several parcels for sale, but the one that caught their attention was 160 acres about 5 miles north of town, with a creek running through it and good grazing land. The price was $800, and it came with a small existing cabin that needed work but was livable. "It's perfect," Clara said, standing on the land and looking around at the red rock cliffs in the distance and the sage-covered hills. "We could build our house right here, with a view of those cliffs. We'll need to keep some money back for building materials and livestock," Jackson said practically. "But we can do this, Clara. We can really do this." They bought the land in March, and Jackson gave notice at the Thompson Ranch, though Robert Thompson was understanding and even offered advice on starting their own operation. With the remaining money, they bought lumber and supplies to expand the existing cabin into a proper house, adding a second bedroom and a larger kitchen. Jackson did most of the work himself, with Clara helping when she could, and by summer they had a house they could be proud of. They also bought 10 head of cattle, 6 heifers and 4 steers, the beginning of their own herd. Clara expanded her chicken operation, and they planted a large garden that flourished in the Utah sun. It was hard work, harder than anything either of them had done before, but it was theirs, and that made all the difference. In late summer, Clara realized she was pregnant. She'd missed her monthly courses twice and had been feeling queasy in the mornings, and when she finally told Jackson, he lifted her up and spun her around with joy. "A baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Clara asked, even though she could see the answer on his face. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Jackson said, setting her down gently and placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "I'm going to be a father. We're going to be parents." The pregnancy was relatively easy, and Clara continued working around the ranch until she got too big to move comfortably. Jackson was overprotective, constantly worried about her doing too much, but Clara laughed off his concerns. "Women have been having babies forever," she reminded him. "I'm strong, and everything is fine." Their son was born in March of 1885, exactly 2 years after they'd bought the land. The birth was long and difficult, with the local midwife attending and Jackson pacing outside until he wore a path in the dirt. But when he finally heard the baby's cry and was called inside to meet his son, all the fear and worry evaporated. "He's perfect," Clara said tiredly, holding the tiny bundle. "Look at him, Jackson." The baby was red-faced and squalling, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air. Jackson touched one of those fists with a gentle finger, and the baby's hand closed around it, gripping tight. "He's strong," Jackson said, his voice thick with emotion. "What should we name him?" They discussed names during the pregnancy but hadn't settled on anything definite. Now, looking at their son, Clara said, "James, after your father." Jackson's father had died when he was young, but he remembered him as a good man, a fair man. "James Xavier," he said, trying it out. "I like it." Little James was a good baby, easy-going and healthy, and he brought a joy to their lives that neither had anticipated. Clara was a natural mother, patient and loving, and Jackson discovered he enjoyed fatherhood immensely. He'd wake early to do his chores so he could spend time with James during the day, holding him while Clara cooked or cleaned, talking to him about everything and nothing. Their ranch grew steadily. The cattle herd expanded, and Jackson's reputation as a fair and honest rancher spread. People who'd once viewed him with suspicion, because of his prison record, now sought his advice and respected his opinion. Clara's eggs and vegetables were in high demand at the mercantile, and she started making extra money selling preserves and baked goods. When James was 2 years old, Clara became pregnant again. This time she carried the knowledge with confidence, knowing what to expect. Their second child, a daughter they named Catherine after Clara's grandmother, was born in the fall of 1887. She was smaller than James had been, but just as healthy, with Clara's dark hair and Jackson's blue eyes. "Our family is complete," Clara said, holding Catherine while James played at her feet. "Is it?" Jackson asked, grinning. "I wouldn't mind a few more." "Let's see how these 2 turn out first," Clara said with a laugh. Life settled into a comfortable pattern. The ranch prospered, the children grew, and Jackson and Clara's love deepened with each passing year. They faced challenges, of course. There were droughts that tested their resources, cattle that got sick, crops that failed. But they faced everything together, and that made them stronger. It was in the spring of 1889, when James was 4 and Catherine was almost 2, that they had an unexpected visitor. Jackson was working on repairing the fence around the pasture when he saw a rider approaching. As the figure got closer, Jackson recognized Sheriff Morrison, though the man looked older and more tired than he had a few years ago. "Sheriff," Jackson said, setting down his tools. "What brings you out here?" Morrison dismounted, looking uncomfortable. "I've got news, Xavier. Thought you should hear it from me. Thomas Garrett died last week. Horse threw him, broke his neck." Jackson felt a complicated swirl of emotions. Thomas Garrett had stolen 7 years of his life, had been the reason he'd gone to prison, had nearly destroyed everything. But the man was dead, and Jackson found he couldn't summon up any satisfaction in that. "Thanks for letting me know," Jackson said finally. "There's more," Morrison continued. "Old man Garrett, Thomas's father, he's dying, cancer. Got maybe a few weeks left. He asked to see you." "Why?" Jackson asked, surprised. "Didn't say, just said it was important, that he needed to speak with you before he passed." "I know you got no reason to go see him, but I thought I'd pass along the message." After Morrison left, Jackson told Clara about the visit. She frowned, holding Catherine on her hip while James played with his toy horses nearby. "You want to go see him?" she asked. "I don't know," Jackson admitted. "Part of me wants to refuse, to let him die without giving him whatever peace he's looking for, but another part of me wants to hear what he has to say." "Then go," Clara said. "You've built a good life despite what that family did to you." "Maybe he needs to see that, needs to know that he didn't destroy you." So the next day, Jackson rode into town and out to the Garrett Ranch, a sprawling spread that made his own property look tiny by comparison. He was shown into the main house by a somber-faced servant and taken to a bedroom where old man Garrett lay dying. The man who had once been powerful and intimidating was now a shell, wasted by disease, his skin gray and his breathing labored. When he saw Jackson, something like relief crossed his face. "You came," Garrett rasped. "Sheriff said you wanted to see me," Jackson said, staying near the door. He felt no obligation to make this easy. "I'm dying," Garrett said unnecessarily. "And I got things I need to say before I go. My son, Thomas, he was a disappointment. Lazy, entitled, thought the world owed him something. When he stole those cattle and blamed you, I knew the truth. I knew it was him." Jackson's hands clenched into fists. "Then why did you let me go to prison?" "Because he was my son," Garrett said, and there was genuine anguish in his voice. "Because I was too proud to admit my boy was a thief and a liar. Because I thought I could protect him, save him from himself. But I was wrong. I destroyed your life to protect him, and it didn't even work. He grew up to be a drunk and a braggart, and now he's dead. I got no heirs, no legacy except the empire I built on lies." "Why are you telling me this?" Jackson asked coldly. "Because I'm trying to make amends," Garrett said. "I had my lawyer draw up papers. Half my estate goes to you and your wife, compensation for what I did. The other half is going to establish a fund to help men who have been wrongly convicted. It won't bring back those 7 years, but maybe it can prevent some future injustice." Jackson stared at him in shock. "Half your estate? That's got to be worth $50,000, give or take," Garrett said. "You'll be one of the richest men in the territory. Use it well, Xavier. Build something good. Be better than I was." Jackson didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to refuse, to throw the money back in Garrett's face out of principle. But the practical part of him, the part that had survived 7 years in prison and built a life from nothing, knew that this money could change everything for his family. "I'll accept it," Jackson said finally. "Not for you, but for my wife and children. We'll use it to build something good, something that helps people." "That's all I can ask," Garrett said, closing his eyes. "Tell that wife of yours she's got more courage than any woman I've ever met. Standing by you the way she did, fighting for you. You're a lucky man." "I know," Jackson said. Garrett died 3 days later, and the reading of his will caused a sensation in St. George. The Garrett ranch and holdings were sold, and true to the old man's word, half the money came to Jackson and Clara. $50,000 was more money than Jackson had ever imagined having, a sum so large it was almost abstract. "What do we do with it?" Clara asked, sitting at their kitchen table with the bank papers spread before them. James was at her feet playing with his toys, and Catherine was napping in her cradle. "We invest it," Jackson said slowly, an idea forming. "We expand the ranch, buy more land and cattle. But we also use some of it to help others. There are families in this territory struggling, people who have been wronged like I was. We could make a difference." They did exactly that. Over the next few years, they expanded their ranch to nearly 1,000 acres, built a larger house that could accommodate their growing family, and established themselves as one of the most prosperous families in southern Utah. But they also used their money to help others. They established a fund to help wrongly convicted men and their families. They donated to the local school and church. They helped neighboring families during hard times. Clara gave birth to 2 more children. Another son they named Jacob in 1891, and a daughter they named Caroline in 1893. Their house was full of noise and laughter, of children running and playing, of love and life. Jackson never forgot where he'd come from, never forgot the 7 years he'd lost. But he also never dwelt on it, never let bitterness poison what he'd built. Clara had taught him that, had shown him through her own example that love and perseverance could overcome anything. It was in 1895, 10 years after their son James was born, that Clara organized a celebration of their wedding anniversary. They'd been married 12 years, together through all the ups and downs life had thrown at them, and she wanted to mark the occasion. "We're having a party," she announced one morning. "A real party with all our friends and neighbors, music and dancing and food. We've got so much to be grateful for, Jackson. I want to celebrate." Jackson, who would have been content with a quiet evening at home, couldn't deny her anything. So they planned a party at their ranch, inviting everyone they knew. The day of the celebration dawned bright and clear, perfect spring weather with wildflowers blooming across the hills. People came from all over the territory. Robert Thompson and his family, Sheriff Morrison, Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile, Tom Riley from the saloon, dozens of neighbors and friends they'd made over the years. Tables were set up in the yard, laden with food. A local band played fiddles and guitars, and children ran wild while adults talked and laughed. Jackson stood on his porch, watching it all, feeling overwhelmed by the goodness of it. Clara came up beside him, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "That day I walked out of prison," Jackson said. "How I didn't know what to expect if you'd really be there." "And you were. You were standing right where you'd promised to be, waiting for me." "I told you I would," Clara said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I meant every word." "You changed my life," Jackson said, turning to face her. "You saved me, Clara. Not just by waiting, but by fighting for me, by believing in me when no one else did. Everything good in my life comes from you." "That's not true," Clara protested. "You worked for this, built this with your own hands." "With you beside me," Jackson said. "Always with you beside me." "I love you, Clara Xavier. I'll love you until the day I die and beyond." "I love you too," Clara said, tears shining in her eyes. "Now come on, let's go dance with our children." They rejoined the party, and Jackson danced with Clara and with each of his children, laughing as James tried to lead his younger siblings in a complicated step he'd invented. The sun set over the red rock cliffs, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the party continued into the evening, lit by lanterns and firelight. Later, after everyone had gone home and the children were tucked into bed, Jackson and Clara sat on their porch swing, watching the stars come out. Clara's head rested on Jackson's shoulder, and his arm was around her waist, and they were quiet in the comfortable way of people who'd been together long enough that silence wasn't empty. "You ever think about what might have been?" Clara asked softly. "If you hadn't been arrested, if we'd gotten married when we planned, if those 7 years hadn't been stolen." "Sometimes," Jackson admitted. "But then I think about what we have now, what we've built together, and I realize that maybe we needed those trials to become who we are. I'm not saying what happened was right or fair, but we survived it. We came through it stronger." "We did," Clara agreed. "And we'll keep getting stronger, Jackson. Whatever comes next, whatever challenges or joys, we'll face them together." "Together," Jackson echoed and kissed her beneath the starlight. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own mix of joy and sorrow, triumph and trial. Their children grew into strong, capable young people. James showed an aptitude for ranching and worked alongside his father from a young age. Catherine was smart and studious, always reading, dreaming of becoming a teacher. Jacob was the wild one, full of energy and mischief, keeping his parents on their toes. Caroline was gentle and kind, with a gift for healing, often helping injured animals or tending to sick neighbors. In 1898, when James was 13, he asked his father about the prison years. They were riding fence together, just the two of them, when James said, "Father, will you tell me about the time you were in prison? Mother said I should ask you." Jackson had known this question would come eventually. He reined in his horse and thought about how to answer. "What do you want to know? Were you really innocent?" James asked. "I know that's what everyone says, but I want to hear it from you." "I was innocent," Jackson said firmly. "Thomas Garrett stole those cattle and blamed me because I was courting your mother and his father didn't like it. I spent 7 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit." "That must have made you angry," James said. "It did," Jackson admitted. "I was furious for a long time. But anger is poison, son. It eats away at you from the inside until there's nothing left. Your mother taught me that. She waited for me, fought for me, never gave up on me. Her love saved me from that anger. So yes, what happened wasn't fair, but I survived it and I came home to build this life with her. That's what matters." James nodded slowly, processing this. "I want to be like you when I grow up," he said finally. "Strong and fair and good to my family." "You're already well on your way," Jackson said, gripping his son's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, James." Time moved forward relentlessly. The children grew and began their own lives. James took over more of the ranch operations as Jackson got older, proving himself to be a natural leader and rancher. Catherine did indeed become a teacher, opening a small school on their property where she taught not just her younger siblings, but also children from neighboring farms. Jacob eventually settled down, marrying a girl from town and starting his own small ranch nearby. Caroline followed her calling to healing, studying with the local doctor and becoming a nurse. Jackson and Clara watched their children build their own lives with pride and joy. They became grandparents when James married a sweet girl named Sarah in 1904 and had a son the following year. More grandchildren followed as their other children married and started families, and the ranch Jackson and Clara had built became the center of a sprawling family network. Through it all, Jackson and Clara's love never wavered. They aged together, gray creeping into their hair, lines deepening around their eyes and mouths, but their connection remained as strong as ever. They still held hands when they walked, still kissed goodnight before sleeping, still looked at each other with the same devotion they'd felt that day under the cottonwood tree in St. George. In 1910, on their 27th wedding anniversary, Jackson surprised Clara with a trip back to that cottonwood tree where they'd reunited. They were both 57 years old now, no longer the young people who'd stood there decades ago, but the tree remained, still standing strong at the corner of Main Street and Tabernacle. "This is where it all began," Jackson said, standing with Clara beneath those branches. "Where I found you waiting for me. Where we found each other again," Clara corrected. She looked up at the tree, its leaves rustling in the breeze. "I used to stand here every Wednesday when the stagecoach came in. For 7 years, every single Wednesday, I stood right here waiting." Jackson pulled her close, marveling at the devotion that had driven her to such faithfulness. "I don't know what I did to deserve you," he said. "You loved me," Clara said simply. "You loved me when I was just a girl with dirt on her dress. You treated me with respect and kindness. You were a good man then, and you're a good man now. That's all I ever needed." They kissed beneath that tree, a long, tender kiss that spoke of decades of love and partnership, and passers-by smiled at the sight of the older couple so obviously devoted to each other. As the years passed into the 1910s, Jackson began to slow down. The hard years of prison had taken their toll, as had decades of ranch work, and his body started to fail him. He developed arthritis in his hands and back, making it painful to do the physical labor he'd once excelled at. Clara aged too, though more gracefully, her hair silver now but her eyes still bright and sharp. They spent more time on their porch, watching their grandchildren play, telling stories of the old days. Jackson would talk about his prison years now without bitterness, framing them as a trial that had ultimately led to blessing. Clara would talk about her years of waiting, about the faith that had sustained her. "I never doubted," she would say. "Not once. I knew in my heart that you'd come back to me." In the spring of 1918, as the world outside their Utah ranch was embroiled in the Great War, Jackson fell ill. It started as a cough that wouldn't go away, then developed into pneumonia. The local doctor did what he could, and Caroline used all her nursing skills, but they all knew Jackson was fading. Clara never left his side. She sat by his bed day and night, holding his hand, talking to him, reminding him of all the good years they'd had together. Their children and grandchildren came to visit, each saying their goodbyes, and Jackson smiled at them all even through his pain. "I'm not afraid," he told Clara one evening when they were alone. "I've had a good life, a better life than I ever expected. You gave me that, Clara." "We gave it to each other," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "Don't leave me, Jackson. I'm not ready." "I waited for you for 7 years," Jackson said with a weak smile. "Now you'll have to wait for me again, but not as long this time. When your time comes, I'll be right there waiting, just like you were for me." "Promise," Clara whispered. "Promise," Jackson said. He died 3 days later on a sunny morning with Clara holding his hand and his children gathered around his bed. He was 65 years old and had lived 40 years as a free man after his prison release. Every one of those years filled with love and purpose. Clara grieved deeply, but not hopelessly. She knew Jackson had meant what he said, that this wasn't the end but just a separation, and that knowledge sustained her. She continued living on the ranch, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, continuing the legacy she and Jackson had built together. She lived another 7 years, growing frailer but never losing her sharp mind or kind heart. She told stories about Jackson to anyone who would listen, keeping his memory alive, ensuring that their love story would never be forgotten. The grandchildren would gather around her, begging for the story of how Grandpa came home from prison and found her waiting, and she'd tell it again and again, her eyes shining with remembered joy. In the summer of 1925, at the age of 72, Clara passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her children found her the next morning, a smile on her face, and they knew she'd gone to meet Jackson at last. They buried her beside him on a hill overlooking the ranch they'd built together, with a view of those red rock cliffs they'd both loved. The headstone bore both their names with a simple inscription: Jackson Xavier and Clara Xavier, faithful in life, united in death. Love conquers all. Their children continued the ranch, passing it down through generations, and the story of Jackson and Clara became family legend. The tale of the cowboy who'd been wrongfully imprisoned, and the woman who'd waited for him, standing in the exact spot where she'd promised to be, became an inspiration to all who heard it. It was a story about faith and devotion, about perseverance through impossible circumstances, about love that could survive 7 years of separation and build a legacy that lasted generations. The ranch itself prospered for decades, expanding and adapting to changing times, but always remaining true to the principles Jackson and Clara had established. The fund they'd created to help wrongly convicted men and their families continued to operate, helping hundreds of people over the years, a living testament to their compassion and their understanding of injustice. In St. George, the cottonwood tree where they'd reunited became something of a landmark. Locals would bring courting couples there, telling them the story of Jackson and Clara as an example of true love. Young women would stand beneath its branches and dream of finding a love that faithful. Young men would vow to be worthy of such devotion. The house they'd built, expanded over the years but still recognizable, remained in the Xavier family for generations. Great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren grew up hearing stories of the couple who'd founded the family legacy, of the trials they'd overcome, and the love that had sustained them through everything. Every year on the anniversary of Jackson's release from prison, the family would gather for a celebration. They'd feast and dance and tell stories, remembering the day that had changed everything, the day the prison gates had opened and Jackson had found Clara waiting right where she'd promised to be. It was a celebration not just of that reunion, but of everything that had come from it, all the lives that had been touched by their love, all the good that had grown from such difficult beginnings. The legacy of Jackson and Clara Xavier lived on long after they were gone, a reminder that love could overcome any obstacle, that faithfulness was never wasted, that the choices people made in the darkest times could lead to the brightest futures. Their story became woven into the history of St. George in southern Utah, a piece of local folklore that happened to be true, a real-life romance that proved such things were possible. And somewhere beyond the reach of time, in whatever comes after this life, Jackson and Clara were together again, no longer separated by prison walls or years of waiting or even death itself. They had their eternity together, just as they'd had their decades on Earth, side by side, hand in hand, exactly as it was always meant to be. The dust has long since settled on that September day in 1883, when Jackson walked out of prison and found Clara waiting. The people who witnessed that reunion are gone, as are Jackson and Clara themselves. But their love story endures, passed down through generations, a beacon of hope in a world that often seems hopeless. Proof that some things, some rare and precious things, can survive anything. Because love, true love, the kind that waits 7 years without wavering, the kind that stands beneath a cottonwood tree every Wednesday watching for stagecoaches, the kind that builds a life from nothing and creates a legacy that lasts generations, that kind of love doesn't die. It transforms everything it touches, and its effects ripple out through time, touching lives that never knew the original lovers but are blessed by their example nonetheless. Jackson Xavier walked out of prison after 7 years, and Clara Hayes was standing right where he'd left her, right where she'd promised to be. And from that moment of reunion, from that kiss beneath the cottonwood tree, from that faithfulness rewarded and love vindicated, came everything good that followed. A marriage, a family, a ranch, a legacy, and a love story that would never be forgotten. That was their gift to the world, and the world has been better for it.